Welcome, everybody, to this evening of conversation about Kuyperianism, among other topics. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. We're glad to see all of you who are here physically and are grateful for those who are watching online and for those who will watch in the future as we post this video afterwards at the IRD website. Our speakers this evening are Shadi Hamid from the Brookings institution, and remotely beamed in from Texas, Matthew Kaemingk of Fuller Theological Seminary, discussing their collaboration on Kuyperianism, which I cannot explain to you, but hopefully they will explain to you. But I'm sure all of you, being well-informed people, know Abraham Kuyper was a Dutch statesman and theologian in the late 19th and early 20th century, who is still tremendously popular as a political theorist and political theologian among many current reform people in the U.S. and presumably also in Europe. One of our speakers this evening is himself Muslim, and I believe he is the only Muslim Kuyperian on the face of the earth, but he could correct me. Maybe that is a growing movement within Islam. So it's a novel partnership between him and Matthew, who of course is a reformed theologian. So Shadi will speak first, unless Matthew, you prefer to go first because you have other obligations. Do you have any time limit on yourself this evening? You're wide open for hours. Good. So Shadi will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then Matthew will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and there will be plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. So Shadi, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for having me. It's great to be here and talk about a topic that has become increasingly important for me and has had a major influence. I mean, and it's nice to see that there are some Kuyperians, from talking to a few people, that there is, I think, growing interest and attention, which is important. So what I'll do, so Matthew is the premier Kuyper scholar. And he can go into more details about specific aspects of Kuyper's thought. What I want to do a little bit more is outline why Kuyper is important to me and has become more important to me over time. And actually, I have Matthew to thank for my introduction to Kuyper. So I think it was in 2017, Matthew just sort of shot me an email out of nowhere, and he mentioned that he had a new book out called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. And, I saw, I think actually the subject line, if I recall, because I was looking back at emails that we had together just to kind of remember how this all started. And actually, his email subject line, which caught my attention, was A Christian Defense of Islam. So I was intrigued. Okay, here's an evangelical theologian. He's emailing me, and that's what he leads with. This is interesting. I'm intrigued. So in his book, Matthew talks about how to apply Kuyper to the very thorny question of Muslim immigration in Europe. And that was my first introduction. I hadn't heard of Kuyper before 2017, 2018. And this was at a time when, I'm sure you all remember, we were contending with the fact of Donald Trump and what the rise of Donald Trump meant for our politics. And it was an auspicious time to become more aware of Kuyper because, Kuyper speaks to our moment in a way that he probably wouldn't have spoke to our moment 10 or 12 years ago. And just a little context on that, I was, before I came back to DC in 2014, I was living in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. And it was at that time that I became much more in tune with the question of how do we accommodate deep difference, not because of America, but because of what I was seeing in the Middle East, that you had these foundational divides around the role of religion in public life. So what I had recalled in the early Obama years is that I think we weren't debating foundational issues. We were debating things like universal health care, marginal tax rates, whether Obama has a tan suit. And some of you might remember that was actually a controversy. It was like an actual controversy, which is crazy in retrospect. And this seemed to me to be very much a contrast with what I was seeing in the Middle East, where people weren't debating anything like that. They were debating the so-called who we are questions. What does it mean to be, in this case, Egyptian, Tunisian, whatever? What is the relationship between religion and the state? What are foundational principles? What animates us at this much more existential level? So I come back to the US and I'm like, okay, here's a contrast. The Middle East is different because in the Middle East they talk about the foundational questions, but our foundational questions as Americans have been more or less resolved. Most Americans believe in the American idea. We share a basic similar sense of the founding and what the founding means. We can differ on details, but we're proud to be American because of the civil religion, all these things that you're familiar with but are now no longer applicable. So to see then in real time how many of my assumptions about being American and living in America changed in this very short period of time, it was in this context that I was exposed to Abraham Kuyper. And as I read more of Kuyper, it was remarkable, and maybe some of you have experienced this. You've had sort of moral intuitions, but you don't necessarily have a language that expresses those moral intuitions, or you're kind of groping and grasping for a framework to put those intuitions into something more cogent or coherent. And that's sort of what I felt with Kuyper, that it was almost as if he was, not to go overboard here, but it was almost as if he was speaking to me and conveying something that I felt. And I'm like, wow. And something clicked in that moment. And then so at first I was reading Kuyper through the secondary sources like Matthew. Then eventually I read more of Kuyper in translation directly as a primary source. And yeah, I got really into it. Now, okay, so I'll just mention the basic Kuyperian, or at least for me, what's one of the important Kuyperian premises. So Kuyper is the major exponent of what we might call Christian pluralism. And the idea here is that we are broken and fallen. We are broken by sin. And because of our brokenness, politics becomes a site of uncertainty, not certainty. And because sin infuses everything, that affects our access to divine will. So we can try to figure out what God wants from us, but because of the fact of sin, there will always be this inherent imperfection. So imperfection is our lot in this life, because perfection is only possible with the return of Christ. And in the meantime, we have to sort of contend with the fact of deep difference in this much more humble and modest way. And to be more than modest, to be aggressive, to think that we can have final victories in this world, in this life, is actually a way of usurping God's sovereignty. And the idea of sovereignty is very important in Kuyper's thought, that God is the absolute sovereign. But what that means is that that contrasts with us as mere mortals. If God is sovereign, we are very much not sovereign. And that means we have to be circumspect about our truth claims and how sure we are of the things that we think are true. That doesn't mean moral relativism, because of course Kuyper is a small o Orthodox Christian. He's very serious about his faith. He would be considered conservative in modern day parlance. So you can be committed to your own convictions, but accepting that others will have a different approach and learning to live with that uncertainty. And this leads me to the second important aspect of Kuyper's thought, which is the idea of the suspension or the postponement of judgment. So Kuyper believes, just as I believe, and we can talk about this some more, that judgment comes, but it doesn't come in this world. And because it comes in the next life, that allows us to take a step back and relax. We can chill a little bit because not everything is at stake in the here and now. So if you're really angry at someone about a political debate, whether it's overturning Roe v. Wade or Trump or whatever it might be, if you know that there's another life and another world, and you know that that's where the final judgment comes. In theory, that should allow you to kind of approach political disagreements with a certain degree of open-heartedness and generosity of spirit, because the truth, the definitive judgment, the harsh judgments, if those are deserved, will only come from God, not from us as mere humans. So this idea of postponing judgment was so I had never really thought about that particular phrase, and it's become such a good organizing principle for me as a Muslim, and this leads me to another interesting part of this. So, as I just laid out, Kuyper comes to these conclusions about living with deep difference based on a Christ-centered premise. Christ is absolutely central in his political and ideological imagination. So someone might say, a Muslim might say, well, Shadi, okay, if Kuyper's getting to these conclusions, but he's getting there because of the idea of the fall, because of the idea of being broken by sin, we have comparable ideas, but in Islam, but not to the same extent. This very strong emphasis on this sort of sinful nature and the unavoidability of sin and how it infuses everything is a distinctly Christian concept. So in that sense, you might say, well, if you don't share the premise, then how do you end up with the implications? I don't necessarily share that perspective, and I should, as might be obvious, definitionally as a Muslim, I don't believe in Christianity's creedal truth claims. In other words, I don't believe in Christ. But that shouldn't prevent me from seeing a certain kind of beauty in the idea of Christian pluralism, or in Christianity more broadly. And I think that I've come to have a deep appreciation for what Christianity can offer, which also puts me in the odd situation of being someone who thinks Christianity isn't true in the creedal sense, but thinks it's good for society. I would prefer there to be more Christianity in America than less, if that's what we're choosing between. And there's also there's capital T truth and there's lowercase t truth, and that gets into an interesting debate about what we actually mean by truth claims. But I think it's possible for me as a Muslim to see lowercase t truth in these aspects of Christianity that have inspired me, and even, to be quite frankly, guided me in some ways as I think about our political moment here in America. And I think that we very much need guides to help us make sense of where we are. The last thing that I'll end with is what was interesting about getting to know Matthew, who you'll hear from in a moment. He's an evangelical, I'm a Muslim. And the more I've spent time with evangelicals and the more I've read people like Kuyper, I can say that I have become, I don't know, a better Muslim, but I've certainly come to appreciate my own faith tradition more in ways that I wouldn't necessarily have expected. And what Kuyper forced me to do, not forced, but inspired me to do, was to go back into my own tradition and find precedents that maybe aren't the same as Christian pluralism, but are maybe in the same spirit of this question of living with deep difference. And I would say all three of the monotheistic faiths have very useful approaches to these questions. Why? Because that's something that religions have to contend with. If you're going to have a great religion which has millions and millions of followers, you have no choice but to contend with the question of how to deal with diversity, whether it's ethnic, ideological, religious, theological, and so forth. So I have been sort of excavating from my own tradition and finding parallels or analogs to Christian pluralism. And that's been, a great and fascinating experience. And the final thing I'll say is, and this is just more to orient us in our conversation, I think that if I have one major insight for kind of like a general audience, even ordinary Americans, on why Kuyper matters, I think Kuyper helps us reorient ourselves on the question of difference. Because I think that we as Americans, we have this tendency, we want to emphasize sameness. When we see conflict, we talk about consensus, we talk about unity, we talk about common ground. Well-meaning liberal interlocutors, when they're doing interfaith or multi-faith, they'll emphasize the similarities between Christianity and Islam. and that's one approach. I actually have very much come to the conclusion that that's probably not the best approach, and I think it can often be counterproductive in ways that aren't obvious. And I think this is hard for Americans to take in, especially the kinds of Americans that I know, kind of liberal elites who live in the major cities. Um, Common grounds, these things aren't even questioned. They're just in the air that we breathe. But what I think is good about an approach that emphasizes deep difference, it allows us to be more honest about our convictions. So it, it means that we don't have to suppress who we are. Because one thing I worry about in the current culture that we have is that people have these very deep convictions, but people are now, as we know from a lot of survey data, they're afraid to express those deepest convictions on both sides, and also depends on who you're around. There's a sense of risk, there's a sense of thorniness that we want to avoid. That we want things to be easier, but what that ends up doing is that it doesn't actually address the fundamental problem in quotation marks, which is that we are in fact different. We as Americans no longer agree on the foundational questions. Instead of papering over that or thinking that somehow we can transcend that, let's address that head on and confront that reality and speak openly and frankly about those differences and where they come from. And why do we believe the things that we believe? So I think that a more constructive approach, if we're thinking about a debate, any debate that's happening right now in the U.S., let's suspend Trump, let's suspend Roe v. Wade. We don't have to talk about that right away. We can save that for another time. Let's talk about what your first principles are. Why do you believe what you believe? And that to me is a better opening, an opening that actually takes deep difference seriously and uses that as a starting point. So I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
All right, can I be heard?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, well, thank you all for having us here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'll try and keep my comments a little bit brief so that we can get to Q&A and discussion. But I'd like to provide just a little bit of historical context for talking about Abraham Kuyper, because I think that his context really sort of illuminates why he's so valuable for today. So Abraham Kuyper comes up in late 19th century in the Netherlands, which was a unique European context because the Netherlands was so deeply divided ideologically, as opposed to a place like Germany, which was dominated by the Lutherans, or England by the Anglicans, or French by the Catholics. The Netherlands was divided into 4 different populations. You had Catholics and Protestants, socialists and liberals. And each of these 4 groups had very different visions of the good life, very different visions of what the common good would be. They couldn't agree, and they did not want to cede power to one another. And they were particularly clashing at this time over the government schools. Each of these groups wanted to fashion the schools or fashion public education towards their direction. So the Catholics wanted to make little Catholics with the schools. The liberals wanted to make little liberals. Same with the Protestants and the socialists. So there was this deep argument about what way of life the Netherlands would pursue and how the public education system would put that forward. And Abraham Kuyper rises in this context, and he's wrestling with these questions of how do we live with deep difference. And ultimately, he argues that what is needed is a generous public space that can give expression to diverse ways of life. And he's particularly fighting with modern liberals. on this debate. He was able to convince Catholics to join him in this pluralistic effort. But the liberals did not want to give up on their dream of a unified secular liberal education system. They wanted to take little Catholic children and little Protestant children and run them through the public education system. Their vision being that if we can give these Christians a secular education, they will become less superstitious, they will become more rational, more enlightened, and we can assimilate them into the modern Netherlands. And we can be a united country, and we can be strong like Germany and France and England. So they considered their ideological division to be a problem that they needed to solve. And so they wanted to use the education system to, quote unquote, solve the problem of Catholics and Protestants. And so Kuyper argued that this was not only unjust, as Shadi talked about, in as far as Christ's sovereignty, but it was also unsustainable, that human beings ultimately cannot be assimilated into one by any governmental force. And he ultimately argued that modern liberalism would consistently struggle to deal with religious minorities because at its heart, modern liberalism does not understand faith, and it doesn't understand how faith works within humanity. And there's three specific mistakes that modern liberalism makes when it comes to religion and faith. And I wanted to outline what those three are, and I think their relevance for today will become quite clear. So the first mistake is believing that faith is a special condition rather than a pervasive condition. So modern liberals tend to think that some people are religious and some people are not, that religion is essentially an affliction that only infects some of us and not others. And what Kuyper argues is no, actually, all people are people of faith. All people have things they believe in or causes that they've given themselves to. And these faiths, these ideologies, these causes function like a lens over your eyes that shape your perspective on politics. And so it's not the case that you have religious people down here who are superstitious, and then you have secular people up here who are rational. There's no kind of hierarchy here. Rather, we are all religious. We all have a vision of the common good. And it's a vision we cannot prove empirically or scientifically or rationally. Rather, we all come with some kind of worldview to the public square. And so if that's the case, Kuyper argues, then we have to be a lot more humble towards our neighbors, because we come with a faith just as they do. The second mistake that modern liberals make when thinking about faith or religion is that they assume that religion is something that can be privatized, that religion is a personal and private thing, that it's, as one says, religion is something that you do in your isolation, when you're alone in your bedroom. That's what religion is, that it's a private and personal thing. Kuyper says this is completely untenable historically, that people's faith you cannot ask a person to hide their faith, because their faith is constantly coming out in their social, cultural, economic, and political behavior. Their faith is influencing every aspect of their life, and specifically their vision of the common good. And these efforts made by the modern liberal state to privatize or to ask people to privatize are fundamentally unsustainable, they're unjust, and they're unreasonable, because every single person, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew, but also a communist, a capitalist, and a liberal are all bringing their faith and their visions of the good life into the public square. So that's the second mistake, the publicness of faith. And the third and final, Shadi alluded to, is the plural nature of faith. That faith itself is diverse and divided, and it will be so until Christ returns again. And this division is deep. It is not cosmetic. It's not merely aesthetic. It's not that simply that Muslims prefer minarets and churches prefer steeples. It goes down to the core of who we are as human beings. And so this divide, this chasm is deep. And furthermore, that there is no human invention or human institution that can unite humanity. So no power of state, no power of business, no power of religion can actually wipe away these chasms. It's Christ alone who can do that at the end of time. And modern liberals reveal that they don't fully understand this as they point to science or rationality or education or today technology as having the ability to unite us again. And so they have an overly optimistic view of the state's ability to unite us through our divisions. And so Kuyper pushes on that and ultimately makes this argument that what was needed in the Netherlands was a pluralistic state, one that created generous space for a diverse range of faiths and ideologies, a state that refused to end the conversation or debate between different religions and ideologies. Rather, it sought to create a marketplace of beliefs and convictions that could contest one another openly and freely. And this was the sort of marketplace that he wanted for his own Christianity, a diverse marketplace where all could participate publicly with their own specific convictions. So I just wanted to add in that sort of contextual conversation and those three basic mistakes or ways in which Kuyper contests modern liberalism. And I found those particularly helpful in talking about Muslim immigration and the ways in which Europeans and Americans have responded to Muslims by asking Muslims to, for example, privatize their faith. So not to wear religious clothing in schools or courtrooms or houses of government, or asking public schools to assimilate Muslims into Western ideologies, or assuming that once Muslims get jobs and learn the language, that they will eventually see that a life of Western consumerism is desirable, and that sort of the marketplace can integrate them. And so it just continues to have a great deal of relevance for this and many other topics around political ethics. And yeah, with that, I'll stop and we can have a little bit more conversation.
Thank you so much, both Matthew and Shadi. We now have time for questions and comments, but please, if you have a question or comment, come forward to the microphone for the benefit of those who are watching online. And I believe online viewers can submit questions. Colin, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Any questions?
So you want people to actually come up there?
Come up here at least. You don't need to be behind the pulpit, but at least behind a microphone.
Yes, the microphone will go.
Okay, I'll ask you a question.
So John, you're going first.
Indeed. Kuyper was, where do you want me? Close enough?
No, that's good.
That's good.
Okay. I'd like both of you to give your evaluation of Kuyper as a prime minister. and how he put all these ideas into effect, and then what, if any, fallout or positive aspects happened in Holland after that. I mean, he finally had his pulpit, and not only that, he brought people in like Herman Bavinck to be a minister, and so he had some really high-powered, intellectual Christianity going on. But was it a good prime ministership? Did it reap anything?
Yeah, I think Matt, that you're probably best equipped to get into the details of his reign as prime minister.
His reign.
That's right.
Well, as anyone knows about a prime minister, their power is less than royal, and so I would say that if you're interested in learning more about Abraham Kuyper's tenure as prime minister, I'd highly recommend James Bratt and his biography of Abraham Kuyper. It's the authoritative biography of Kuyper. Just a couple of comments on that. I would argue that Kuyper's influence in the Netherlands was actually much more profound through the newspaper that he founded, the university that he founded, and the political party that he founded. And on top of that, all of his shelves and shelves of editorials and books and manifestos that he wrote. He was not a particularly, in my mind, he was not a particularly successful prime minister or effective prime minister. He was very effective at writing and speaking. But I would say that he lacked, in my mind, a sort of political humility and willingness to compromise that is so important in parliamentary politics. And so his tenure as a prime minister was not terribly effective. He was much more happy and effective outside the halls of power, pressing upon and playing the role of the underdog and the critic. So yeah, but one practical implication that's related to what I talked about was a reformation of the governmental school program in the Netherlands that is still there to this day. So to this day, there are Muslim schools, Catholic schools, Buddhist schools, liberal schools, socialist schools that all receive governmental funding in the Netherlands. They have a pluralistic education system because of their conviction that no single religion or ideology should be allowed to rule the public schools, that it is not the state's responsibility to pick religious winners and losers when it comes to the education of children. Now, every school in the Netherlands has certain basic standards around learning math and history and reading and writing. But those schools are, run along the lines of diverse philosophies and religions and ideologies. And that is one consequence of Abraham Kuyper's political leadership. So I'll say that.
Yeah, so I would just draw on that to mention a couple, I think, broader implications of this. So I think one lesson is that if we want to influence politics, political power isn't always the best or the right or even the most effective way of doing it. That we live in complex societies where there are different points of influence, and writers, thinkers, theologians can have a major impact in the absence of political power. And I think Kuyper is a testament to that. But I think there's also this, and this is something we have to acknowledge and be forthright about. It seems that Kuyper was not able to fully practice his own instincts. I don't know, Matthew, if you'd agree with me in that precise wording, but there does seem to be a disconnect between the richness and fullness of his Christian pluralist vision before he came to power, and then his inability to compromise as much as one might have wished when he was actually in power, a certain kind of political stubbornness, which is a lesson that even for those who basically devise a certain way of looking at the world, they can still struggle to put into practice their own foundational insights. This is challenging. And just in the Islamic context, there are a number of examples of people who had, again, amazing or inspiring or very influential ideas before coming to power. And then you see what happens when they're actually in power, and there is a big gap. And you have to make sense of that. How, like, so, and not even just in Islamic context, we have people who were some of the biggest advocates of democracy 20 or 30 years ago, someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, moving in a more authoritarian direction. There's a lot of examples like this where, and that tells us something about the corrupting influence of political power, but it also just tells us that we may not always want our heroes to actually be governing us.
Shadi just commented a little bit on the sort of getting into political power side of things, but I have a question about sort of the religious side of these things. As a person does become more comfortable with a deep difference and acknowledging that fact, it's easy to say that that's a fact, but it's often the case that religious sort of sojourners will say to a person who has an increasingly sort of appreciative, pluralistic vision of things, wheat and tares growing up side by side, the rain falling on the just and unjust alike, that they're relativist. And I would imagine that Professor Kaemingk has heard this question a gazillion times. If you are a fan of deep difference in society, if you want to be comfortable with that, quote unquote, you're just not trying hard enough. You're not being faithful to the tradition that we all, after all, here share. And so I'm curious about your best piece of advice, whether with a politician, a cleric, in a more theocratic society, maybe in a Muslim context, or the fellow well-connected student at a CCCU school, Matthew, who says, you're just selling out. You're just selling out. What are the norms for advancing a thoughtfully pluralistic vision, principled pluralist vision, as being sitting rightly with the deep convictions of truth that most of us hold?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I'd love to hear what Shadi has to say from an Islamic context, because Shadi is also regularly pushed on whether or not he's Muslim enough, as he's generous to others. I think the kind way is simply to say, no, I really do believe in Christianity, and I'm not a relativist. But what I would actually push back and actually go on the offense and say that Christians who feel the need to use political power to dominate other faiths through a religiously authoritarian type rule, that betrays not so much a deep faith in the sovereignty of God, but actually a weak faith in the weakness of God. Because ultimately, the religious authoritarian believes that God is weak and that God is in need of help, that God can't redeem this country. I need to take it back through the use of political power. Furthermore, the religious authoritarian is also convinced that they are weak in terms that their religious message is weak in terms of its persuasive power. So my faith cannot be persuasive in the public square unless I use political power to help it along. So my response to those who would call me a relativist is actually no. My faith in God is so strong in his sovereignty and in the power of the gospel, that I do not need the state to help me talk about the power of the Christian faith. And furthermore, my God is not so weak that he needs me to reign right here and now. And so I think the best response is actually to go on the offense and talk about the fragility beneath the religious authoritarian, whatever it would be.
Yeah, that's great. So I think it's worth acknowledging that Matt and I are in the minority. So our views have not won the day, as you can probably tell just by looking around you. I think this country would look very different if these sorts of ideas about postponing judgment were popularized. So we do, and that raises an interesting question. And I've asked Matt before. Okay, Matt, this makes a lot of sense. Kuyper's thought, it seems coherent in a way that I find very compelling. But then why is it that so many evangelicals in America don't seem to actually model those principles in their behavior politically? Again, we go back to this question of a disconnect. Why haven't these views won the day? And one can make a similar argument about Islam. And we didn't really talk about like the Islamic precedents for a deeper pluralism, but they are certainly there. They've been somewhat obscured by history and recent political developments. But one might say that when you look at Muslim majority societies, there seems to be something lacking when it comes to living with deep difference. So I guess it's just worth acknowledging that. And I wonder what Matt would say about, yeah, we have a lot of work to do is number one. Now on the relativist issue, I think that I can say this because Matt and I have talked about it publicly in different places, and I hope it doesn't make him feel uncomfortable. But of course it won't, because part of what we do, we're very open about our convictions, so I think it'll be fine. But so if you knew Matthew, you would know it would be very clear he wasn't a relativist, and one of the examples of that is, how do I put this gently? I don't know if it's fair to say that he wants to convert me, but he would like it or enjoy it or see it as a positive development if I found Christ. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I want to convert you.
So if you had talked to me several years ago, and I would have been uncomfortable with that idea that someone who's a dear friend, who has come to know me on a personal level, wants to convert me. That's a challenging one, and that's a very good test when we talk about deep difference. How do we feel about that? Is that something that we can sort of get on board with? There's also, I should say, a little bit of imbalance because, and we don't have to go into why, but I don't actually want to convert Matthew to Islam. So in that sense, like one might say, well, if both of you felt that way about each other, that I want to convert him to Islam, he wants to convert me to Christianity, we would sort of be on an equal playing field. But there is a little bit of an imbalance. But so I remember when I told Matt, yeah, listen, it might sound weird, but I just don't really have any particular interest in you becoming Muslim. And he said half jokingly, but also perhaps also half not jokingly, Shadi, like, I'm kind of disappointed that you don't want to convert me, because if you think that you have found the truth, you think that you have found the right path, wouldn't you want to share that with someone you care about? Why wouldn't you want to share that with me? And I really appreciated that response, which is a good way of looking at it. So in some sense, I can sort of flip the script and think of it and say, well, that Matt actually is interested in introducing Christ to me is actually a sign of a deeper friendship, that there's a deeper care there where he wants to share this with me. I don't have to take it. I don't have to agree with it. But that is part of who he is. That's important. And I guess like evangelical, it's almost in the name by definition to evangelize. So not exactly a secret to all of you. So I would never want to ask evangelicals to hide that part of them if that is in fact what they want and feel. So that's a way that actually the opposite of relativism can actually fit quite well, whatever you would like to call that, can fit quite well with our approach. And in some ways, it actually strengthens the kind of, I don't want to say absolute, but foundational convictions. And I think Matt is a good example of someone who doesn't compromise on his foundational convictions, doesn't dilute them, and that actually makes our dialogue and our discussions better, in my view.
A question from our online audience from Bruce Clark, who asks, did Kuyper address the issue of whether different religiously based systems of family law, divorce, inheritance, etc., can coexist in the same country? He commented, in addition, that is a hard test for any model of symbiosis.
The short answer is I don't think so. So as I said, it was Catholic, Protestant, liberal, and socialist. So I cannot speak to that. The Muslim population in the Netherlands was so insignificant that Muslim marriage courts were not a discussion point. So yeah, I think when it comes to appropriating Kuyper for today, one needs to do some analogical work and use your imagination a little bit on those kinds of questions. I think I would say that Abraham Kuyper had a very high view of the family and a very low view of the state's purview over how a family is run. And so analogically speaking, Abraham Kuyper would want to allow for a diversity of marriages within the Netherlands. That's not to say that he didn't have very strong opinions about the family from a biblical perspective. He was very conservative in his vision of the flourishing Christian family. However, once again, he would not want the state to be playing an active, progressive role in shaping and forming the family, because he believed that the family was something that was created by God, not by the state.
And I would just add, just listening to Matt right now, the question of the state and how we feel about the state is coming up, obviously. And I think this is where some analogy and context becomes important. Both Islam and Christianity develop in a period where the state is relatively weak. And I would say, certainly for Islam was not designed for the nation state. And that's a little bit of a longer story, but before, in the pre-modern era, there just simply weren't strong states, and that's why when you look at the development of Islamic law, the Sharia, it is not a state-centered law. It is the law of the jurists, and the clerical class plays an autonomous role and is in some sense independent from the state apparatus. And then that allows the clerical class historically to provide a meaningful check on executive power. So there ends up, so sometimes some scholars talk about how you have a kind of implicit and sometimes explicit separation of powers in the Islamic tradition. And obviously, it's now that there are strong states, and now the state is how we understand politics, and all of us naturally think about state power when how do we change the societies that we live in? We think about how do we win an election and how do we get in a position where we can push our views. And this is what we see throughout the Middle East. The competition for state power is so intense and so unyielding because whoever is able to capture the state can define the religious character of the nation. And in Middle Eastern countries, there are various camps that are extremely opposed. To oversimplify, you have Islamists on one hand and non-Islamists on the other. Non-Islamists can include secularists, nationalists, leftists, whatever. But because they don't agree on such foundational questions, every election is utterly existential. And that's why oftentimes democratic outcomes are overturned. And we've seen that in a number of cases, Egypt most prominently in 2013. And that I think has some important lessons for how we think about democratic outcomes in our own countries. That's why whenever anyone says this is the most important election of our lifetime, that is not a good thing, and we shouldn't think of our elections that way. An election should never be the most important election of our lifetime.
One final comment on marriage and family law within pluralistic religious societies. There is a scholar named John Whitty who's at Emory. He heads up the Center for Law and Religion there, who writes about this issue a lot. And it's no coincidence that he is actually a Kuyperian. He's shaped by this Dutch Reformed political theology. And if you'd like to investigate this more, his recent book, Church, State, and Family, was published in 2019, and he's got another book coming out on faith, freedom, and the family, new studies in law and religion. That's John Whitty, W-I-T-T-E.
Thank you both for taking the time to speak with us. I have two questions, but if in the interest of time you got to drop one, feel free. The first of which is, I'm just curious how far you feel like this pluralism can extend, because you alluded to that it can go all the way to first principles. But what I was thinking about is, in some of the early modern thought, people like Locke and Rousseau, who are wrestling with this question, say that you can have political pluralism, but it has to be underwritten by a metaphysical consensus, that we all agree on first principles, so we can disagree about some of the particulars. And even social psychology is proving this, that humans, we don't bind societies by kinship, but by myth, that you need a meta-narrative, you need a myth. So how far can we kind of take this pluralism? And the second was the comment you made about delayed judgment. I don't think I'm using the right term there, but I think it was an interesting observation because, and this is something pointed out in Hebrews, that something unique about Christ is that delayo, that he is the sacrifice once and for all. And as you were explaining, one of these Kuyperian ideas is that all humans are religious. So as we secularize, we're actually paganizing. And in all of pagandom, you see these sacrifices that happen imminently in the here and now. So I was just wondering if you can kind of sketch what your concern is, or what that looks like if we do make imminent and immediate a lot of these judgments that are properly delayed until Christ's return.
Yeah, great question. So yes, it would be preferable if a metaphysical consensus was possible. That does make things easier when you share some, certain foundational principles across most of the population, myths as well. The question is whether that's an ideal, but I don't see any plausible scenario through which Americans come to find a metaphysical consensus. So it's more a practical argument that we don't have that and we're not going to have that, so we have no choice but to find a way to live with people who disagree with us metaphysically. Now, we might have been able to argue that as of, say, 10 years ago or 20 or whatever, that there was a metaphysical consensus when it came to the myth of the American idea or the American dream or the American civil religion. But I don't think we have that any longer, and I don't see how that can be rebuilt. Even to the extent that, as many of you know, living in DC, I feel like even things that would have been banal and innocuous and were innocuous many years ago to say about America and how you feel about America, to even express admiration, perhaps even love, to say I love America in front of a liberal, it's unfortunately, and I'm on the left of center, so I sort of see this as my tribe. I don't agree. I mean, I'm sort of in a weird position because I have major disagreements with my tribe now. But there has definitely been a shift where there's a certain way of talking about America, and that's a major divide. And we opened up the can of worms about the founding, and maybe that's good in some ways, but obviously that can hurt us in other ways, since we can't even agree that the founding was good, or that even the idea of an American state was good. So that complicates matters. So first I would say we don't have a choice but to make it work without metaphysical consensus, and I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be possible. We have examples like in the Netherlands. We have to different degrees, Belgium, Switzerland have different kind of consociational models. The problem is for consociational models to work, you have to weaken the state. It becomes hard to do the consociational model when you have a national or federal state that is extremely powerful. And that's why the question of the state is pretty central in these debates. And it's sort of a be careful what you wish for. Like for those of us who are on the left side of the spectrum, we might say, well, oh, the state is important for redistribution. That's important. But it's also a be careful what you wish for, because it's hard to sort of say, okay, the state will be empowered on economic redistribution, but it won't be empowered on cultural and identity issues. If there was a way to separate those, I think we'd have a path forward. Sadly, it seems that those two are often, and even Bernie Sanders is an example of it, someone who's very much focused on the economic side was pretty much dragged towards being sort of woke in a way that wasn't entirely persuasive and probably hurt him. And, you know, that's where the Democratic Party's going for now. So it suggests that you can't necessarily separate these things as we might wish.
I think that's really well said. I think I'll also add that the limits of pluralism are also related to the character of the people. Deep diversity, deep difference requires a lot of patience and humility and generosity from the population. And if a particular population has no patience for a particular minority, if they have no humility or generosity towards that minority, if they don't really want that minority in the country, there's not a lot that a government can do to change that. And so in order for democracies, diverse and deeply different democracies to be sustained, you need a political character within the nation. And so pluralism is very demanding. You know, if you're in you know, a country that is monocultural, monoracial, and monoreligious, it does not demand a lot of its citizens as far as living within it. So in many ways, this is an important experiment that is America. But I think we also have to recognize that, yeah, democracy demands a lot of us. It demands a lot, and it demands political virtues that it cannot create. So then the next question for political theologians is, you know, who can cultivate the habits and virtues and practices of democracy if the state can't do that?
A question for you both. What would a classical liberal of today say in affirmation and critique of Kuyper? And what would a contemporary illiberal or post-liberal or integralist say in affirmation or critique of Kuyper?
I can take the post-liberal side. Matt might have a better sense of the liberal critiques of Kuyper, which do exist. So if we're talking about Catholic integralists or post-liberals, anti-liberals, and so forth, they're not Kuyperians at a very fundamental level, because they do believe in final victories in this world. I mean, in terms of defeating their opponents, that's what I mean by that. They see that the other side is very bad, if not, you know, worse than very bad, and that liberals, Democrats have to be defeated conclusively. And this is where I take issue. And, you know, I've had this debate with people like, you know, Sohrab Ahmari, who we had on our podcast debating this some time ago, and I respect where he's coming from, but the language of the very intense, aggressive, confrontational language, I just can't get on board with it, and I just don't know where it ends or how it ends, because to the extent that the post-liberals want to defeat liberals or Democrats or whatever, unfortunately, many people on the left side of the spectrum want to conclusively defeat Republicans and conservatives, and especially Trump supporters. So basically what we have is two sides increasingly seeing the other side not as competitors, but as enemies to be defeated. And that's just not sustainable. Now, that's why I would posit that there's nothing we can do about the fact that there are these different sides. There are no conclusive victories that are possible in our lifetime. Again, I can't imagine any scenario where post-liberals will be able to defeat liberals in America. What would that look like? It would require coercion. So what we're talking about basically is either we coerce the other side and we get them to submit to us, or we find a way to live with the other side, to really oversimplify it. I'm not aware of any other option that we have.
Yeah, so on the liberal side, the critiques would be, sort of classic critiques of public religion. So there would be an appeal to the wars of religion, that when you allow religion into the public square, that religion divides, religion is violent, it's backwards. And so the Kuyperian call to bring more religion into the public square is problematic because religion is inherently divisive, violent, and anti-democratic. Another would be that religious speech in the public square is inaccessible. And so saying that Christ is sovereign over all, or Christ will judge, or we are sinful, or things like that in the public square, the liberal would say your theological language is incomprehensible to me, and I would request that as a good neighbor, you make statements that I can understand and that I can comprehend. And so I would request that you speak in a sort of Esperanto language. So you edit yourself in the public square to speak with liberal terms. So in this way, a Muslim girl who wears a headscarf, when she is explaining to the court why she wears a headscarf, she must say that, well, I wear this headscarf to express my freedom of speech or to publicly express my religion. Even though the true reason why she wears that is out of a pious submission to Allah. But she's not allowed to use that language in the public square. She is expected to say, I'm expressing myself when I put the hijab on. And then finally, a liberal, because modern liberals focus deeply on the individual as sort of the atomistic building block of all society and politics, they would find Kuyper to be too communitarian and too institutional in the way that he thinks about politics. So ultimately, the liberal understanding of religion is that it's an individualistic and private thing. And so what freedom of religion means to the liberal is the freedom to personally believe private individual doctrines. It is not so much the freedom to establish religious schools and hospitals and clubs and organizations. So there is sort of a lack of a corporatist understanding of faith within the liberal political imaginary. So, I mean, those are just a few, but there are many others.
Sorry to ask a second question, but the IRD guy asked a second question, so cheat a little bit. Curious about the piece you were describing earlier, Matthew, about sort of the loss of humility and curiosity, generativity, character in the broader fabric of the country that makes it less friendly to thick pluralism, to Kuyperian pluralism. And what about that? So specifically, I have in mind the piece that Shadi wrote in about a year ago on has America replaced politics for religion?
Yeah.
Is that how it was? Something along that line. Politics is the meaning maker now and not religion. If we've gone down by 20 points in institutional religious affiliation in the last 2 decades, how does that fare for the argument that you guys are advancing? Does it make it harder? Should we want for the growth of Kuyperian pluralism more religion in different places around the world? Does that make it easier? Not always. How does the decline in institutional religiosity impact the argument you guys are raising here?
It's a great question. I think it helps in the sense that we have had this precipitous fall in religious identification in America, as all of you know. And it's really stark when you look at the numbers. So hovering around 70% plus church attendance from the 1930s until about 2000. Then from 2000 to 2020, it just plummets very quickly from like 72 or so to 48. That's like a massive drop in a very short period of time. Now, so we have a bit of a natural experiment. How has America fared over these past 20 years? I would say it's been a pretty challenging 20 years or so. And if anything, ideological division and fragmentation have intensified. Polarization has intensified. And this goes against what the secular expectation might be, that the less religion you have in public life, the more reasonable and rational and chill and calm people will be, because you're able to sort of cordon off those religious passions which cannot, that are unconstrained and so forth. But what we find out, in part because of what Matt said earlier, and Kuyper had this fundamental insight, we are all believers. We just believe in different things. So if you don't believe in religion anymore, if you no longer believe in Christianity, you're probably going to search for something else to take its place. Unfortunately, as it turns out, some of the things that take Christianity's place are not better. And I would say they're not just not better, they're not good. So whether it's, white nativism, ethno-nationalism, wokeness on the left side of the spectrum, they all have a religious intensity to them, but they're not actually about God. They're religion without religion. So it's almost in some ways the worst of both worlds. If you want to do religion, do religion. If you want to do whatever the other things are, don't bring in the religious intensity to it. So I think there is more openness, at least as far as I can tell, for these kinds of arguments. We have a long way to go. But, that's why we write, that's why we speak. All of us wake up and we want things to change in our country. And, hopefully more people will find these insights compelling.
Yeah, so just adding on to all that great stuff. If you're a student of Muslim extremism or Christian extremism, what you'll find is that the danger zone is a young male who is unemployed, who is not regularly attending church or mosque. As they become disconnected from institutional religion and move into online religion, they can quickly become radicalized. So essentially what happens is when you lose your connection with embedded institutional faith and move into disembedded online faith, you can become radicalized quite quickly. And so I think we're seeing that with secular forms of identity politics, is that these secular forms of identity politics are online and they go cosmic and grand. And so there's very little check on the sort of mediating and moderating and formative spaces of a local congregation of believers. So you're no longer being mentored by elders in the faith. You're no longer being humbled. You're no longer sort of collaborating and compromising in your local religious community. Now you're in an online community that is completely disembedded from those checks and those religious checks and balances. And so you can become radicalized. And so I guess what has happened in the last 20 years, as Shadi just said, really helps our argument that, there aren't some people who are religious and some people who are rational. We are all deeply religious. And it is a question of whether or not our religion is equipping us well to live with deep difference, or if that religion is equipping us to dominate that deep difference. So, yeah.
And I would just add to that, if we look at the Middle East, because I think that the default Western perspective is that, oh, look at Islam's role in the Middle East. That hasn't worked out well. And there's almost this presumption that, of course, the solution in the Middle East is secularism. As it turns out, I mean, most of the governments, with a couple exceptions like Saudi Arabia and Iran, have been ostensibly secular for much of the modern period. So what we're talking about are secularizing states that really go out of their way to regulate religion. They see religion as something that has to be controlled by the state. And this is also, it's natural for a nationalist. If you're like a real nationalist, you don't want religion to compete with the aims of the nation. So in some ways you have to constrain religion and keep it within the fold of a nation and unleash its powers perhaps for national aims. So this is why there's always this kind of tension between let's say religion and nationalism. Sometimes they can be fused together in ways that I don't think are terribly appealing. So when people ask me like, so what do you do in the Middle East? I think the fundamental question facing the Middle East today is how do you accommodate Islam's role in public life? Up until now, the primary option that's been exercised by authoritarian regimes is suppressing religious movements and religious groups and controlling religion and religious production. And that has distorted Islam. So when we talk about how Islam in the last 100 years has become more strict, more legalistic, the things that we see that we may not approve of, we have to ask ourselves, how did Islam become more this way? And I would posit that when the state gets very involved in religious production, it distorts the nature of the religion, and we can see how that has turned out in the Middle East. Again, we have two choices. Either you suppress Islam in the Middle East and find a way to constrain it through force, or you find a way to accommodate it. What does it mean to accommodate Islam's role in public life? You need to have some semblance of democracy, not necessarily liberalism. And this is where I don't always love the conflation between liberalism and democracy. You can obviously have democracies where groups come to power that aren't liberal. So the question is, how do we feel about those outcomes? But that's really a universal question. How do Americans feel about the outcome if Donald Trump wins in 2024? This is the fundamental question in most of these societies, is what do you do when someone or some party that is personally threatening to you and your community comes to power through free elections? Either you find a way to respect it, even if you hate it, or you end up no longer believing in democracy. I would suggest that the former is the more appropriate option, because the latter, that's just a future of a cycle of coercion and God forbid violence, including in our own country at some level. And I say this, to my side as well. Like if Trump wins in 2024 and he wins fair and square, I don't have a choice. I have to respect that outcome. But that's hard for people to do. That to me is really the fundamental test, is can people get around to the idea that bad or even evil people can come to power through legitimate electoral means and find a way to live with that instead of trying to overturn the result.
Is there a final question or comment?
Get
Well,
somebody else, yeah, get somebody else.
Very interesting talk. I was interested how Kuyper might look at how the ever-changing definitions of language might figure into societies that are kind of unable to live with each other. Think in the past few years how, especially among young people, there's this idea that words are equal to violence, but also violence can kind of be real violence can be waved off as just kind of like the marginalized groups raising their voices against injustice. What would you have to say about that? What would you say about that?
I can guess what Kuyper might have said, but I'll maybe leave the Kuyper interpretation to Matt in terms of how I would respond to that, drawing on what I consider to be Kuyper's principles. Well, first of all, he was alive over 100 years ago, so I imagine he wouldn't be very sympathetic to the idea that words equals violence. That seems to be, as far as I can tell, a more recent phenomenon, very recent, in fact. I don't remember really hearing people saying that all that much until just the last couple of years. And like probably many of you, I find it somewhat bizarre because it does devalue what we mean by coercion. I think it's very important for words to have meaning. And if we say that words are violence, then as you sort of suggested, then what do we call actual violence? Is that just also called violence? Is everything violence? And because I think violence is very dangerous for democratic societies because it takes people outside the democratic contest, we have to be very clear what we mean when we say violence. And also we can't agree on what words would constitute violence. Like let's say hypothetically you got 95% of Americans to say, okay, these words equal violence. Maybe you could sort of make that work, but obviously most Americans don't agree on what words should constitute violence. So there's just nothing that's what I would say. I don't know if Kuyper, if you have anything to add on that, Matt, in terms of how you think Kuyper would have interpreted that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think one sort of analog is old European blasphemy laws and discussions about, drawing a picture of Muhammad and the ways in which those debates have taken place in Europe. I think that in general, Kuyper definitely believed that certain things were sacred and that they shouldn't be disrespected. However, it seems to me his political theology creates a framework in which the state is not the arbiter of what is sacred and what is not, and what constitutes desecration. And so it would seem to me that within a pluralistic society, he'd be very much a proponent of free speech because of the critical role that it plays in democratic discourse and the need for these deep convictions that diverse citizens have to be actually expressed. So the suppression of deep convictions is what creates a politically volatile situation. Not so much the expression, but when the suppression of those sorts of things. And I think, there is an argument to be made that an aspect of Donald Trump's rise has to do with the suppression of certain feelings and passions within the people and wanting to express deep convictions. Now, those convictions, having been expressed, can be debated, but when they're suppressed, then that creates a politically volatile situation. That said, I think that let's put the state and law to the side. I believe that culturally, Abraham Kuyper provides a theological system by which I can recognize a Muslim's headscarf as a sacred thing that should not be removed. Kuyper helps me recognize the headscarf as a sacred thing that should be respected. Kuyper's theology helps me recognize that I should honor my Muslim neighbor's desire that Muhammad not be drawn. Not out of sort of a legal political framework, but just as being neighborly. Because I'm a Christian, I have this understanding that certain times and places and things are sacred. And being neighborly means honoring those things. And so I think there is a struggle within the secular liberal framework of actually honoring sacred things. And so what's happening here in thinking about words as violence is sort of an argument that my own identity is sacred. So there's and your words are injuring my identity. And so it would be blasphemous of you to critique my identity or my perspectives. And so, yeah, it would be an interesting thing to evaluate that posture as an emerging religion, that words can constitute violence. So, yeah, just a few thoughts.
And Matt put his finger on something I think is absolutely essential when he said that certain identities here in the US with the rise of Trump were suppressed. And, it's just a reminder. I don't think people normally think, to the extent that people think Trump is bad, they don't necessarily see it as about suppression of conviction or identity. But that, I think, is a big part of the story, that liberals in America are, but also were, so culturally dominant that a growing number of Americans felt that they couldn't be themselves or they didn't have religious freedom. We can debate whether that's an accurate perception, but certainly many evangelicals and Catholic conservatives felt that they couldn't express certain parts of who they are in the public sphere. So for obvious examples being on gay rights, that after losing that battle culturally, there was a perception that if you don't support gay marriage in the public debate in mainstream institutions, you'll automatically be seen as a bigot. So in some sense, be careful, we all deep down, maybe we have this desire to be culturally dominant, but cultural dominance is a dangerous thing for a society because it creates reactions that are hard to anticipate. It distorts the natural balance of a society. Oops, sorry.
Shadi and Matthew, thank you so much for a very insightful and stimulating conversation. We will post this video online, hopefully tomorrow, hopefully with a transcript, thanks to one of our interns sitting here this evening. And to those of you who are here physically, thank you for your contributions to this conversation. Feel free to hang around for further talk, eating, and drink. And all of you who are watching online, many thanks to you. Good night.